Hi, I'm Abdul Saad, clinical psychologist at Vital Mind Psychology here in Sydney, Australia. And today I come to you with the second video in the new series on depression. And in this video, I want to be discussing the psychoanalytic or psychodynamic theory of depression. Bear with me in this video because some of these concepts can be a bit tricky, but I'm going to do my best to explain it in plain English. So the psychoanalytic or psychodynamic theory of depression comes from the psychoanalytic or psychodynamic school within Western psychology, which was the dominant school or dominant way of thinking within clinical psychology and psychiatry for the first half of the 20th century. And its most famous proponent was Sigmund Freud, the Viennese neurologist and therapist, who in his time created various theories and frameworks with which to understand the mind and malfunctions within the mind, such as anxiety, neurotic and obsessive compulsive behaviors. And essentially the psychoanalytic or psychodynamic view of the mind is of the mind in motion. That's why the term psychodynamic, that the mind is in motion. There are moving parts within the mind that are interacting, but often these interactions and these dynamics within our mental life are largely outside of our conscious awareness. So that's one of the great contributions of the psychoanalytic or psychodynamic school, is of really highlighting the importance of the unconscious within our mental life. Now, when it comes to depression, in 1917, Sigmund Freud published a very important paper. So that was 101 years ago now, 1917. And that paper was called Mourning and Melancholia. So basically, in this paper, Freud detailed the striking similarities between mourning or grief and melancholia, what was called melancholia back then, which we today would call depression. And essentially what he said is what's striking is that both grief and depression look so similar. The person who is in mourning, who is grief-stricken from the loss of a loved one, a love object, as would be said within the psychodynamic tradition, experiences strikingly similar symptoms to the person going through melancholia or depression. There's a reduction in mood, there's a lowered interest in previously enjoyed activities, there is reductions in energy, in appetite, there's disturbances in sleep. And Freud found this interesting, and what he essentially said was that both mourning and depression, mourning and melancholia, were essentially responses to loss. So that in the psychoanalytic theory of depression, loss is very important, a sense of loss. However, what Freud then asked in the paper was that, okay, so there are similarities, but there's one striking difference between mourning and melancholia, or mourning/grief and depression. And that is, in depression, it's only in depression that the individual experiences a marked reduction in their self-esteem, in their sense of self. So we see in the depressed individual self-recrimination, feelings of failure, of worthlessness, feelings of low worth, of low self-worth predominate, whereas this is not usually the case in mourning. The person who is in mourning can retain a usual coherent sense of self while the mourning process is ongoing. And this marks the psychoanalytic theory of depression for Freud in how he goes on to explain in this paper, Mourning and Melancholia, or how can we explain why the depressed person has low self-esteem but the person in mourning doesn't, when both of these look so similar, feel so similar, and are essentially a response to loss. And what Freud essentially said is that in mourning, in the grief process, there is a tangible loss. There's been a death of a loved one, for example, and the individual is working through that process of grieving, and with the knowledge that that love object is no longer there, is gone. And essentially the grief process is the process where the individual withdraws, gradually begins to withdraw the life energy which they had invested in their love object, until a point where they can fully accept it and begin to move on with their lives. So there's a retention of self-esteem in mourning, whereas in depression or melancholia, Freud theorized, which is the heart of the psychoanalytic theory of depression, is that the person developed low self-esteem because of what Freud called it was a mechanism of anger turned inward. And this is the sort of the key idea within the psychoanalytic model or theory of depression, is that depression occurs when anger is turned inward. Another way to put that is when anger is converted into self-hatred, turned inward, so it becomes self-hatred or self-loathing. And I'll give an example of how this might develop in a depressive context. So essentially what Freud is saying here is that the low self-esteem we see within the depressed individual is actually anger that individual feels toward a loss in their lives, but they've been unable to experience that anger and instead have turned it inward. And I'll give an example. So if a child experiences their parent as cold, uncaring, intrusive, unreliable, the child will feel very threatened to have in their conscious awareness that their parent is all of those things. My parent is unreliable, my parent is unloving, my parent is not really there for me. So that would create a state of psychological annihilation or death for a child to come to that realization about their parent. So, and also, if the child realized that, allowed that to enter into conscious awareness, the child would have to feel anger and hatred toward the rejecting parent. So instead, what the child does is the child takes in the aggressive and negative feelings they feel toward the parent and internalizes them inward. So I become defective, I am unworthy. And then I've dealt with those ambivalent or conflicting feelings between feeling that my needs are not being met and the anger or hatred toward the rejecting parent. And I resolve that ambivalence by essentially internalizing my own sense of defectiveness. It's anger turned inward. And this is essentially Freud's idea that in depression, people have suffered an early loss or losses in their life, an early disconnection from a love object, the parental figure, typically the mother within the psychoanalytic tradition. Some significant loss that the child couldn't really deal with, and instead internalized the anger which would have been rightly directed toward the object which was not meeting, or the parental figure. When I say object, it means the love object that was not meeting the child's needs. Instead of that anger going toward the love object that was not meeting the child's needs, the child internalized that sense of anger into self-hatred and self-loathing. And Freud goes on to explain that this can set the stage for many depressive episodes throughout the person's adult life in response to loss, both real and symbolic. So, for example, in response to loss of a job, the individual with this sort of unconscious drive operating where they're internalizing anger and basically redirecting inwards of self-hatred. If this sort of person in adulthood experienced a loss of a job, they would find it very difficult, for example, to consciously become aware of the anger and hostility they feel toward their company, toward their employer, and instead would internalize that, would redirect that inward as self-hatred, and it would be when they're depressed as I'm unworthy, I'm a failure, I'm not a good provider, I wasn't up to the job, etc., manifesting in the depressive episode. So essentially, if we boil down the psychoanalytic theory of depression, we see some core concepts. One, the concept of loss is critical. That within the psychoanalytic model or theory of depression, loss is a central theme within the development of depression, and there is an early loss, early in our development, that sets us up for depression, which is anger directed inward or self-hatred in our adult life, if we are vulnerable to experiencing episodes of depression. So the first key variable with laying down the framework for being vulnerable to depression, according to this theory, is some early loss, which was, and secondly, is that loss produces an internal conflict for the child. It produces ambivalent feelings, where the child has to sort of balance difficult emotions of, do I reject? Do I feel hostile toward my parent who is not meeting my needs? Because if I do that, well, then I have to accept that they're not really there for me and that I'm all alone. That's too difficult. That's far too distressing for a child. So instead, what I will do, and this is all unconscious, this is why it's within the psychoanalytic tradition, this process is unconscious. Instead, what I'll do is I will transfer onto myself all of the negative attributes of the parent. I will own them. I will be the bad one. I will be unlovable. I will be unworthy. And in that way, my parent can escape scrutiny, and I can go on with the sense that they can, at some level, meet my needs, and they're not totally unreliable, because really the problem lies with me. So the key thing is a sense of loss. The loss produces ambivalent feelings, which the child deals with by redirecting inward as a sense of self-hatred and self-loathing. And this sets the stage for the development of depression in response to future losses. Now, one of the things that Freud noted in his paper is that often the loss is out of conscious awareness when future episodes are occurring into adulthood. And this is related to the process of the quickness within which the person prone to depression can turn their anger inward into that self-loathing and self-hatred, and be really unconscious of that internal dynamic, that internal ambivalence that they're feeling when they're experiencing a loss in their life. So I hope that summarizes the psychoanalytic theory of depression. And this sort of model, this sort of theory was very dominant, as I said, within psychology up until about the 1950s. It's now fallen out of favor. I personally feel like this model, or this theory, does have some merit. I think it gives us insights into some of the unconscious processes that can occur within depression. I think the concept of anger turned inward, anger becoming self-hatred or self-loathing, as a way of dealing with ambivalent feelings, I think that can be of value to helping understand the development of depression. But as I said, this has fallen out of favor, but I think it still holds some merit. And Freud's ideas, although psychology has made massive advances from when he was engaging in his own experiments and his therapy and his writings, they still definitely have an influence within the field of psychology. So I hope for the psychology students out there, the psychology buffs, as well as those of you who are interested in understanding depression from this older psychotherapeutic perspective, the psychoanalytic model, I hope that the video has been of some value. And in the next video, I will be delving into the cognitive behavioral model of depression, which is a much more recent model, which with some similarities, but quite a different framework, which I'll be explaining hopefully next week. Okay, thank you very much for tuning in, and I hope to see you next week with a new video. Take care. Bye-bye.